I should start off by saying that a little bit like Rick, who we've just heard from, I also haven't worn fancy dress today, but I have dressed up my Zoom background, and I want to thank Jacqueline Robbins for providing me with these festive neurons. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge of Alzheimer's disease and similar disorder and therapeutics. So Shakespeare's sixth age, you could argue that this is either late midlife or early old age. As I career into that sixth age, I much prefer the former. I like to think of it as late midlife, but whatever it is, the question I want to ask is, are we heading towards an upgrade? Are we actually coming closer to therapeutics? And in all honesty, I have been working in this field for 30 odd years, and you could argue we haven't made much of a progress yet. We certainly don't have any drugs for Alzheimer's disease, treatment or prevention. But as I'll briefly show you, I think we do know how to make progress. I think we are actually heading towards an upgrade. So this is going to be quite a quick run through. I was thinking maybe I should start off by reading this, but Sophie did such a brilliant job at the beginning of the day that I'm not going to. But the point I want to make, I suppose Shakespeare was making really, that this age is a transition age between justice and decline, between midlife and sans everything. And it's that pantaloon, that character, slightly maybe losing it, slightly not behaving in the way that he or she always did. And I think there's an interesting point there about Alzheimer's disease, because I think what Shakespeare was pointing out was this sixth age is the age that neurodegeneration starts, but is often not obvious. So you may get a bit of a hint that this is beginning to happen. I think people themselves really do know that this is beginning to happen, but it's certainly pre-dementia. And as Rick's just shown us, there is that decline of aging. That decline is much accelerated and more severe in people who go on to get Alzheimer's disease. But the area of opportunity for an upgrade is in that preclinical mild cognitive impairment space. So I'm going to try and make three relatively quick points. First of all, the recent history of this area has been focusing on plaques and tangles, but I want to say it's not just plaques and tangles. We need to pay attention to other neuropathologies. I want to say something about picking the right target, but the take-home message is it's no good just having the right target. You need to have multiple targets, because honestly, it's really difficult to pick the right target. And the third message, the take-home for the talk, is we need to do smarter clinical trials. We simply cannot expect to make progress if we carry on doing things the same way as we've always done them. So this is the area, this is the model of Alzheimer's disease that I've always had in my mind as I've been researching in this area. In broad terms, something to do with genes and environment affect the processing of the amyloid precursor protein. That gives rise to plaques. Plaques somehow give rise to tangles, and it is the tangles that gives rise to Alzheimer's dementia. So this is a continuum. Arguably, what is the right target there? I think the right target is very difficult, really, isn't it? Because the amyloid precursor protein, the evidence for that being the right target is so overwhelming. You could argue there's more evidence for that being the right target than there is almost anywhere else in medicine, in terms of determinative genes, risk genes, protective genes, the environment, the understanding of the biology. But if what I've just said, that Alzheimer's disease is part of a continuum that starts in the sixth age of life, but doesn't affect you until the seventh age of life, that is, it takes decades, honestly, starting right at the beginning is, if nothing else, very costly. It might be better to focus more on the neuropathology of tau, of tangles, because those are almost certainly the executioner of disease. It's those that are affecting neurons. And Alzheimer himself knew that when he looked at the brain of Augusta D. He saw something like this. It seemed obvious to Alzheimer, as I think it does to most of us, that those neurons filled with neurofibrillary tangles are not functioning, and so they're not. But I beg your pardon. But it's not just APP, amyloid pathology, plaques, or tau pathology, tangles. We now know that there are multiple other pathologies that give rise to syndromes that are either very similar to or identical to Alzheimer's disease. So the tau pathology gives rise to multiple tauopathies, including frontotemporal dementia, something that Karen Duff has worked on and obviously getting the award today is hugely justified based on her work. But we now also know that there are other pathologies. The most recent one, TDP-43 pathology, more usually associated with ALS, gives rise to this, or motor neurone disease, gives rise to this condition, now called late or limbic associated TDP-43 encephalopathy. In all honesty, the vast majority, all of those people have been diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease in the past. But there's also synuclein pathology, gives rise to Parkinson's disease when it affects the substantia nigra, but when it affects the cortex with more or less identical pathology, gives rise to dementia with Lewy bodies. And I've worked in this field long enough that I can remind you that that very first patient with an APP mutation, the APP717 family that John Hardy and colleagues identified, those individuals also had synuclein pathology, and that was noted at the time. So that idea of the continuum from plaques to tangles to pathology is almost certainly right, but it is a little bit more complicated, and there are multiple pathologies that give rise to a syndrome that, in all honesty, is very similar across cases. But it isn't entirely similar. And dementia with Lewy bodies is a characteristic syndrome that one can identify, where there's a triad of symptoms with the fluctuating confusion, the visual hallucinations, and Parkinsonism. Simon Russell Beale, the Shakespearean actor, famously played King Lear, as we've got a Shakespeare theme going on today, famously played King Lear as a man with dementia with Lewy bodies. In the play, Lear has a fluctuating confusion. At various times, he behaves slightly abnormally. He gives away all of his kingdom to his daughters. He becomes what looks like delirious when he's on the heath. But towards the end of the play, he seems fairly cognitively astute. He is also, when he's on the heath, he has visual hallucinations and he's talking to them. And Simon Russell Beale has a relative who's a doctor who pointed this out to him. And he then played King Lear as somebody with dementia with Lewy bodies. And if you really want to, you can go to this URL and you can see a discussion that I did a gig at the Gielgud Theatre with Simon Russell Beale. Thankfully, he did most of the talking, where we discuss Shakespeare's portrayal of aging and could Lear have had DLB as part of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. So I think it's important to pick the right target, and I've worked on tau all my life, and I think it's a pretty good target, but we really do need more targets. We need more shots on goal. And of course, we know it's not just the pathology or the pathological inclusions, it's also inflammation, it's a generalized proteostasis, it's synaptic dysfunction, and probably other pathologies too. So the target space in these diseases is opening up hugely. And I'm pleased to say that multiple pharmaceutical companies, academic groups around the world are following up on that opening of space. You can begin to see it. Jeff Cummings and his colleagues do this excellent analysis of drugs that are in clinical trials every year. And just between 2018 and 2019, you can see that the field began to move from a highly amyloid focused therapeutic pipeline to increasingly diverse pipeline, from 54% of all drugs that were in clinical trials being anti-amyloid to 32% in just 1 year, with tau becoming apparent, and more importantly, with other modes of action. So I think that's really encouraging, and we need to see more of that. But I think my last point is probably the most important one, and that is we need to do smarter clinical trials. Currently, what we've done is just try and move from trials of people in dementia to trials earlier in the disease process. Now, the good news about that is if you had a successful drug in the preclinical or mild cognitive impairment space, that drug would be a preventative strategy. It would, as far as the patients are concerned, prevent the disease. That's called secondary prevention, when the process has already started, but it's either clinically, it either has no clinical effects or very marginal clinical effects. The problem with that is moving trials ever earlier in the disease process is fabulously expensive and time consuming. I don't know about you, but I'm simply not prepared to wait for clinical studies that won't read out until I'm well into the 7th ages of being human. I want to see clinical trials that are effective in the next 5 years. And if it's more than 5 or 10 years, we need to do something about that. They're also very expensive. It's commonly said that a clinical development program in dementia costs in the region of $1 billion. And I have to say, that's not far wrong. And if you go earlier in the disease, it costs more because you have to do longer trials, and you have to do bigger trials because the number of readouts that you get will reduce, and you'll lose patients to follow up. In order to make those clinical trials more effective, and speaking to the multiple pathology issue, you need the right patient. So one of the most embarrassing for the field observations is that in many of the large phase 3 clinical trials that have been done for amyloid agents, up to 20% of people in those clinical trials actually don't have amyloid pathology. It turns out that clinical diagnosis isn't good enough as a predictor of even core amyloid pathology, let alone TDP43 or synuclein pathology. So we need biomarkers. And I want to make a point that there are at least 2 different kinds of biomarkers that we need. We need stratification markers to help us recruit the right people to the right clinical trials. But we also need progression markers. And I think in a way, those are even more important. That is, we need markers to get more rapid clinical outcome data. So this was one of the most fantastic tweets of the year. This was a tweet from Sebastian Palmquist, who tweeted, I think it's figure 2 from his fantastic study showing that plasma phospho-tau at epitope 217 gives amazing prediction of pathology. It gives great prediction of all sorts of things. In fact, it's highly discriminative to clinical diagnosis. It's highly discriminative to tau PET. It's highly discriminative to rates of disease progression. So we are already there. We have a great blood assay biomarker, not only for tau, but also for amyloid, although that's a little bit more complicated. We also have PET markers of amyloid, tau, and neuroinflammation. And we have proteomics, metabolomics, and genomics, all of which have been shown to predict progression. The big challenge for 2021 and beyond is, can we do the same for markers such as synuclein and other pathologies as we have for Alzheimer's disease? But I think we're really on the doorstep of doing smarter clinical trials with better selection using biomarkers. But what we really need to do is biomarkers for measuring outcomes in the preclinical space. So it's kind of obvious when you think about it, how can you do a clinical trial in preclinical disease when by definition, there are no clinical outcome measures? You have to wait till people convert to dementia. That means very long, very large clinical trials. So there are now efforts underway to see if we can use different types of technologies to find markers of progression in the preclinical prodromal space. I want to draw your attention to a Dementias Platform UK study, the Deep and Frequent Phenotyping study. The PI is Vanessa Raymond at the University of Oxford, but this is a national study, incredibly complicated to do deep phenotyping, meaning amyloid and tau PET, but also blood, CSF, urine, MRI, both structural and functional, MEG, EEG, retinal measures, cognitive measures, gait, and also using connected devices for measuring activity, cognition, function, and doing almost all of those, other than the PET imaging, obviously, at frequent times over the period of a year. So every 2 to 3 months. This has never been done at this depth or frequency before, but the study group, and I hope others will join in, will, when this study is completed, look to see whether any of these measures, either independently or in combination, give more efficient phase 2 proof of concept trial outcome measures. So let me come back finally to Shakespeare's sixth age, and this is very much following on what our previous speaker, what Rick has told us. You'll see that the sixth age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon. By wearing slippers, Shakespeare is indicating that this guy is stepping into a time when he's doing less. Maybe the slippers have been on for too long and his activity in the world has decreased. And as we heard from Rick, that midlife activity, and indeed earlier, is super important. He has a pouch on the side. That's referring perhaps to his love handles, but his shanks have been shrunk. I think that's an indicator of less exercise in the fifth age. And I think we know now that lifestyle interventions, increasing activity, both intellectual, cognitive activity and physical activity earlier in life, are likely to be really important. It's not just drugs, but it's also lifestyle interventions. So in conclusion, the sixth age and Alzheimer's disease, I think we are, excuse me, ready for an upgrade. It's not just plaques and tangles. We've got to pick multiple targets. We've got to do better clinical trials. I think we're making progress in all areas. The multiple overlapping pathologies and the long pre-dementia phase are recognized and are real opportunities. Target discovery is already diversifying, but I would add that target validation is a real challenge in this area. And I think we're at least on the doorstep of moving to more effective clinical trials. We're already now universally introducing biomarkers for recruitment and stratification, but I think we will be heading towards an era where we can do biomarkers using a whole range of molecular imaging, electrophysiology, and importantly, connected devices or wearables to get better at measuring progression before there are actual symptoms. Are we ready for an upgrade? Yep, I think it's on its way, and I'm looking forward to the years ahead. Thank you very much.